Welcome in. We are so glad you are here with us because you are the kind of person who is always looking for that aha moment, right? That little piece of hidden knowledge that just completely reframes how you see the world.
Oh, absolutely. And today's deep dive is definitely going to deliver on that.
It really is. We are going under the hood of human nature today. Our mission is to explore these invisible operating systems running in our minds, the systems that dictate how we connect with people, how we love, and even how we curate our own memories.
Yeah, the rules we don't even know we're following.
Exactly. And to ground this deep dive, we are looking at a truly landmark research paper. This was published in 1985. It is called Security in Infancy, Childhood, and Adulthood, a Move to the Level of Representation.
A bit of a mouthful, but...
Oh, a total academic mouthful. But the authors, Mary Main, Nancy Kaplan, and Jude Cassidy, they literally changed the game with this.
They really did. Because, for a long time, psychologists only looked at physical behavior to understand how humans attach to each other. Like if a baby cries when mom leaves the room, or if they cling to a leg.
Right, just pure physical metric.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But this paper attempts something revolutionary. They wanted to track how a baby's physical behavior, the crying and crawling, morphs into a 6-year-old's language and imagination. And then ultimately into an adult's entire personality.
Which is just wild to think about, that the way you relate to others right now as an adult isn't just some passive memory, it is an active, ongoing set of rules, a system that literally censors your attention. And today, we are going to unpack exactly how scientists figured that out.
And to start, we really need to look at an incredible story they used to frame this whole concept.
Oh, the story of Thomas? Yes. Okay, so I want you to imagine a 27-month-old boy named Thomas. So he is just over 2 years old.
Just a toddler.
Right. And due to some unfortunate family circumstances, he has to be separated from his mother for 10 days. And for those 10 days, he stays with this couple, James and Joyce Robertson, who actually happen to be researchers.
Which is very convenient for the history of psychology.
Super convenient. Now, before this separation, Thomas had this wonderfully warm, deeply affectionate relationship with his mom. They were incredibly close. So to help ease the transition, Joyce Robertson decides to regularly show Thomas a photograph of himself and his mother together.
Just a simple physical reminder.
Exactly. And on the first day, Thomas reacts exactly the way you would expect a toddler to react. He looks at the photograph, he smiles, he brings it up to his face and kisses it.
Oh.
I know. He holds it tenderly. He even says out loud that he likes it. So he is actively seeking proximity to his mother. And in her absence, he's using this flat piece of paper as a substitute.
Which is a totally normal adaptive behavior.
Totally normal. But as the days drag on, something profound and honestly deeply unsettling begins to happen. A few days into the 10-day separation, when Joyce shows him that exact same photograph, Thomas no longer kisses it.
He starts to pull away.
He does. He stands back. He keeps his eyes downcast. He nervously fiddles with the toy in his hands, completely avoiding eye contact with the image.
Wow.
And then, by the very end of the 10-day separation, his behavior completely inverts. When presented with the picture, Thomas actively turns his back on it. He moves away, his face is all clouded with anxiety, and he explicitly demands that the photograph be put away.
It is just a staggering behavioral shift to observe in a child that young. I mean, we were talking about a 2-year-old.
Yeah.
And what makes it so critical for our understanding of human psychology, the sheer mechanics of the situation. Because if you look at the variables, the photograph itself did not change.
Right. It's just an inanimate object.
Yeah, right. Exactly. It's a piece of paper. It didn't suddenly alter its expression. It didn't scold him. It didn't physically push him away. The environmental stimulus remained entirely static.
So the only thing that could have changed was Thomas.
Yes. The only variable that could have possibly changed over those 10 days was Thomas's internal mental representation of his relationship with his mother. Over the course of that separation, his mind actively reorganized its own architecture.
Like it updated its own software.
That's a great way to put it. The initial strategy, seeking comfort from the image, it was failing to produce the actual comfort of his mother. So to manage the overwhelming distress of that unmet need, his cognitive system deployed a completely new operation.
It shut the need down.
Exactly. He began to actively restrict his own access to a visual reminder of his attachment figure. He wasn't just passively ignoring the photo. He was expending mental and physical energy to actively block it out.
And that transformation right there, going from a physical reach to an invisible psychological barrier, that is the beating heart of what we are analyzing today.
Yes.
It's the core of the whole thing.
So let's unpack this core concept because it's foundational. We are talking about John Bowlby's internal working model.
Right. Bowlby is the godfather of attachment theory.
Exactly. But I want to make sure we don't reduce this to a simple idea. It's not just having a memory of a person. Like, it's not a static Polaroid in your mind where you just think, oh, my mother was generally supportive or my father was distant.
No, it's much more mechanical than that.
Right. It's kind of like imagine your mind has a spam filter, but instead of filtering out junk emails, it filters emotions and memories and attachment signals.
That is a perfect analogy, because Bowlby proposed that as human beings develop, we construct a working model of the world, a working model of ourselves, and a working model of our primary attachment figures.
Okay.
But what Main, Kaplan, and Cassidy do in this 1985 paper is they take Bowlby's concept and they fuse it with cognitive psychology. They define this internal working model not just as a picture, but as a rigid set of rules.
Rules that dictate what gets past the spam filter.
Precisely. These rules organize information relevant to attachment. And crucially, they dictate whether you are allowed to obtain access to that information or whether you must limit your access to it.
Okay, so how do these rules actually get written? Because babies aren't born with a manual.
No, they aren't. To explain that, the researchers draw heavily on cognitive concepts, specifically Gene Mandler's work on event schemata, or scripts.
Okay, let's pause on the word script. Because when we say script, we usually mean words on a page that actors recite.
Right, like a movie script.
Exactly. But in cognitive psychology, a script is something entirely different, isn't it?
Yes. In psychology, a script is more like a neurological blueprint for how a specific sequence of events is supposed to unfold based on your past experience. Mandler argued that human cognition doesn't just store random, isolated facts.
They aren't just filing cabinets.
Exactly. We build our understanding of reality through sequences, action, and outcome. The researchers argued that our internal working models of relationships are built from these exact attempts and outcomes.
Okay, break that down for me. Attempt and outcome.
So let's look at it from an evolutionary perspective. From the very beginning of life, an infant possesses this biologically hardwired imperative to seek proximity to a caregiver when they feel threatened, tired, or distressed.
Because if a baby in the wild doesn't seek a caregiver, they don't survive.
Right. It's not a learned behavior. It's a survival mechanism honed over millions of years. So the infant feels distress and initiates an action. They cry, they reach, they crawl. That is the attempt.
Okay.
The internal working model, this entire complex system we are talking about, is constructed entirely out of what happens next, the outcome.
So it's literally an algorithm in the brain.
It is an algorithm. If an infant is frightened, makes the attempt to seek proximity to the parent, and the outcome is that they are consistently comforted, soothed, and accepted.
Then the brain writes a specific script based on that positive data.
Exactly. It encodes a rule that basically says, when I'm distressed, reaching out results in safety. Therefore, my own signals of distress are acceptable, and the outside world is responsive.
And that creates the foundation of what we call the secure script.
Yes, the secure attachment model.
But the alternative outcomes are where the spam filter really kicks in, right?
Right. Consider what happens if the infant's attempts to gain access to the caregiver are consistently blocked or ignored or even actively rejected. The infant's cognitive system has to adapt to a vastly different reality.
Because the biological drive to seek comfort is met with a total lack of comfort.
Or perhaps even punishment. So to survive in that specific environment, the brain writes a totally new script. It encodes a rule that says, seeking comfort leads to rejection and prolonged distress. Therefore, the safest strategy is to suppress the biological urge to reach out.
Wow. So they just shut it down.
They have to. This leads to an insecure avoidant model. The child literally learns to deactivate their attachment system to minimize the pain of rejection.
That is heartbreaking, but mechanically it makes perfect sense. And then you have the third variation, which just sounds incredibly exhausting.
The ambivalent model. Yes.
Right. So if the caregiver accepts the infant's attempts, but does so unpredictably, like meaning sometimes they are wonderfully warm and responsive, but other times they are completely unavailable or distracted or just emotionally absent.
The brain cannot write a consistent script.
Because the algorithm keeps getting contradictory data.
Exactly. It writes an erratic rule that leads to an insecure ambivalent model. The child never knows which version of the caregiver they are going to get.
So their system just goes on high alert constantly.
Hypervigilant. They maximize their distress signals just to ensure they get noticed.
Okay, wait, I have to play devil's advocate here for a second.
Please do.
Because if you are a scientist and you were observing an infant in a laboratory setting, how can you possibly claim to know that a complex cognitive script is running inside a preverbal kid's head?
It's a very fair question.
Right, because if you were just watching a baby interact with their mother in a playroom, couldn't a skeptic easily argue that the baby doesn't have an internal working model at all? They might just be reacting to whatever the parent is doing right in front of them in real time. Stimulus and response.
Sure. Mom smiles, baby approaches. Mom frowns, baby stops.
Exactly. That doesn't require a sophisticated internal architecture. That just requires basic eyesight and reflexes.
That is the exact methodological critique the researchers anticipated. It was a massive wall they knew they had to climb. Because you are right, as long as the infant and the caregiver are interacting in the same physical space, an observer cannot definitively prove that an internalized concept is guiding the child's behavior.
Because the behavior could entirely be a product of immediate, real-time reactions to the partner's subtle cues. A shift in posture, a tone of voice.
Yes. So to truly prove the existence of an internal model, they realized they had to borrow a conceptual framework from Jean Piaget.
Oh, Piaget, the godfather of child development.
Exactly. He is the one who formalized the concept of object permanence.
Right, the idea that a baby learns a toy still exists even when you hide it under a blanket.
Exactly. Piaget demonstrated that you cannot know if an infant possesses a mental concept of an object while the object is sitting right in front of them. You have to place the blanket over the toy. You have to remove the physical stimulus.
So if the infant searches under the blanket, they have achieved object permanence. They hold a mental representation of the toy in its absence.
Yes. And Maine, Kaplan, and Cassidy realized they had to apply this exact same logic to human relationships. To see the internal working model of attachment, you have to test the child's knowledge in the absolute absence of the attachment figure.
You have to move to the level of representation.
Exactly the title of the paper. You have to look at how the child manipulates language, memory, and symbols when the parent is nowhere to be seen.
Which brings us back to Thomas and the photograph. That was an early glimpse into this phenomenon, a symbol in the absence of the parent. But to conduct a rigorous longitudinal study, the Berkeley researchers couldn't just rely on anecdotes about a kid named Thomas. They needed a massive baseline. They had to scientifically classify a large group of infants, map their attachment strategies, and then wait years to see how those physical strategies evolved into mental representations.
And to get that baseline, they utilized arguably the most famous laboratory procedure in all of developmental psychology.
Mary Ainsworth's strange situation.
Yes, the absolute gold standard for assessing infant attachment.
So for our listeners who might not be intimately familiar with the mechanics of the strange situation, let's break it down really quick. It is a highly structured, roughly 20-minute laboratory procedure, and it's designed for infants between 12 and 18 months old.
Right, and the infant and the caregiver are placed in a novel environment, usually a playroom with toys.
And then, over a series of 8 strictly timed episodes, the infant experiences a sequence of mild stressors. A stranger enters the room. The caregiver leaves the infant alone with the stranger. The caregiver returns. Then, the caregiver leaves the infant completely alone. The stranger returns. And finally, the caregiver returns again.
And the absolute genius of Ainsworth's design is that it's not really about the separation. We tend to think culturally that a child who cries the loudest when the parent leaves must love the parent the most.
Right, we see the crying as proof of the bond.
But that's not what the researchers are measuring at all. The critical data point, the window into the internal working model, is the reunion.
It's entirely about what the baby does when the parent walks back through that door.
Exactly. The reunion behavior reveals the infant's organizational strategy.
So what does a secure reunion look like?
In a secure dyad, when the parent returns, the infant actively and directly seeks proximity and comfort. They might crawl to the parent, reach to be picked up, and perhaps cry to signal their distress.
Which is healthy.
Very healthy. But crucially, once they are held and comforted, they settle down relatively quickly and return to exploring the toys. Their emotional system is open. They can transition from distress to comfort to exploration fluidly.
But the insecure patterns look drastically different.
Drastically.
The insecure avoidant infants essentially execute that shutdown script we talked about earlier. When the parent returns, they do not seek comfort. In fact, they actively ignore or turn away from the parent.
Yes. They'll actually stiffen if picked up.
They stiffen, wow. And they focus this intense, almost unnatural amount of attention on the inanimate toys in the room, right?
Yes, it's a diversion tactic. And then you have the insecure ambivalent infants. They show a chaotic mix of anger and intense proximity seeking. They want contact, but when they get it, they resist it.
So they reach out, but then they push away.
Right. They might arch their backs, push away, or bat away toys offered by the parent. They are completely consumed by the relationship and cannot return to exploration. They just can't calm down.
And Main and her colleagues emphasize that these patterns are fundamentally about the flow of attention.
Yes, attention is the currency here. They actually tested this further in what they called a clown session.
Okay, a clown session.
Yeah, it was a mildly stressful scenario where an unfamiliar adult dressed as a clown interacted with the infant.
That sounds more than mildly stressful to me.
Fair enough. But what they found was that in secure diets, attention flows freely and organically. The caregiver doesn't force the infant to look at them, nor do they force the infant to look away.
But in the insecure patterns, attention is rigidly constricted by those internal rules.
Exactly. The avoidant infant is psychologically forcing their attention away from the caregiver and hyper-focusing on the environment to suppress their attachment needs. The ambivalent infant is completely monopolized by the caregiver, unable to spare any cognitive resources for the outside environment.
Okay, so you have these three neat, scientifically validated buckets: secure, avoidant, and ambivalent. It seems like a perfectly wrapped package. But as the researchers were analyzing the videotapes from the Berkeley Social Development Project, they hit a massive, glaring anomaly.
Yes, a huge one.
The data wasn't clean.
It was far from clean. They were reviewing dozens of strange situation videotapes, and they found that a significant portion of the infants simply defied the existing classification system. They couldn't be categorized.
They reviewed 36 specific tapes of infants whose behavior was profoundly perplexing. And if the researchers were forced to use Ainsworth's original criteria, they would have had to classify many of these highly distressed infants as secure.
Which is wild.
Wait, really? Let me stop you right there, because this is where the methodology seems like it could completely fall apart.
Oh, it almost did.
You're telling me that researchers were looking at profoundly distressed, confusing behavior, and because it didn't look perfectly avoidant and it didn't look perfectly ambivalent, the default mechanism of the scientific establishment was just to toss them into the secure bucket.
Basically, yes.
Doesn't that heavily corrupt years of psychological data? You'd have a massive pool of quote-unquote secure data that is actually contaminated by highly distressed kids.
You have hit on the exact crisis that faced the field of attachment theory at that moment. Yes, it absolutely skewed the data. If an infant did not show consistent avoidance and did not show consistent angry resistance, the exclusionary criteria of the existing taxonomy dictated they must be secure, even if their behavior looked deeply troubling.
That is just a massive oversight.
It was. And recognizing this failure of the classification system was a monumental breakthrough. Mary Main and her colleague, Judith Solomon, they refused to force the data to fit the theory. Instead, they expanded the theory to fit the complex reality of human behavior.
Which is what good science should do.
It's exactly. Through painstaking frame-by-frame analysis of these tapes, they identified a brand new fourth category of attachment insecurity. They designated it Category D, insecure, disorganized, or disoriented.
And the descriptions of these Category D babies in the paper, they're some of the most haunting clinical observations I have ever read.
They are very difficult to read.
When the parent returned during the reunion episodes of The Strange Situation, these infants didn't seek comfort, but they didn't deploy a clean avoidance strategy either. Their behavior looked fundamentally broken.
Like a system failure.
Yes. The researchers describe infants exhibiting dazed behavior. Some would literally freeze in depressed postures, just stopping all movement in the middle of the room.
Just freezing completely.
Others would show simultaneous contradictory behaviors. For instance, an infant might start walking toward the parent to seek comfort, but their head would be forcefully averted, looking in the completely opposite direction while approaching.
Approaching backward, essentially.
Exactly. Or they would initiate a movement, like reaching out, and just fail to complete it, letting their arm drop limply.
To understand this disorganized classification, we have to look at the biological paradox these infants are trapped in.
Okay.
As we established, proximity seeking in the face of fear is biologically hardwired. When the amygdala detects a threat, it sends a signal to the motor system that says, run to the caregiver for safety.
Right, that's the basic survival script.
But what happens when the caregiver is the source of the fear?
Oh, wow.
Or, as is often the case, what if the caregiver is themselves deeply frightened, traumatized, or dissociation-prone, and they project that terror onto the infant?
The infant's cognitive system enters an unresolvable loop.
Precisely. The amygdala fires, demanding approach for safety. But as the infant approaches, the caregiver triggers further fear, demanding flight for safety.
So the motor system is receiving simultaneous commands to approach and to flee.
Yes. And the result is a behavioral collapse. The infant freezes or exhibits those disjointed, contradictory movements because the internal working model cannot compute a solution.
It's like a computer encountering a fatal error and just blue screening.
That is exactly what it is.
And the paper explicitly notes that the majority of these Category D children had parents who had suffered unusual trauma in their own attachment histories, such as the unresolved loss of an attachment figure before the parent had completed high school.
The trauma was literally cascading down generations.
Right, corrupting the infant's operating system before it could even fully install its basic survival code.
Exactly. So with this new comprehensive baseline established, the researchers finally had their map. They had identified the secure infants, the avoidant infants, and the newly defined disorganized infants.
And they conducted these assessments when the children were 1-year-old with their mothers and at 18 months with their fathers.
Right. Having cataloged the physical behavioral manifestations of these internal working models, they waited.
They waited half a decade.
Yes, 5 years.
Fast forward to age 6. The researchers invite 40 of these families back to the laboratory in Berkeley. The average age of the children is now roughly 69 months. And let me paint the picture of this laboratory visit because the setup itself is vital to understanding the results.
The setup is so clever.
It is. The family arrives right away in this seemingly casual gesture. The researchers take a Polaroid photograph of the entire family together.
Just a quick snapshot.
Right. After this, the parents are taken out of the playroom. They're led to separate offices for about an hour to undergo extensive interviews. And the 6-year-old child is left behind in the playroom with a researcher designated as the examiner.
And the overarching goal of this visit is to see what has happened to that infant internal working model over the span of 5 transformative years. Has it changed? Has it dissolved? Or has it evolved?
And the first metric they analyzed to answer that question was the physical reunion. After the hour-long separation, the parent returns to the playroom. Unlike the strict timing of the strange situation, this was a highly casual, unstructured 3-minute reunion.
Right, the parent was simply told they could go back into the room with their child. The researchers videotaped this interaction and utilized a 9-point scale to rate the child's behavior for security.
And the stability they found across that 5-year gap is nothing short of stunning. They found that the correlation between a child's security rating with their mother at age 1 and their security rating with their mother at age 6 was 0.76.
I want to pause on that number for a moment.
Yeah, please do.
Because in the behavioral sciences, achieving a correlation of 0.76 in a longitudinal study over a 5-year developmental period, this is a period where the child learns to walk, talk, and form complex social relationships. It is exceptionally rare.
What would a normal correlation look like?
Typically, researchers might hope for correlations in the 0.3 or 0.4 range. A 0.76 correlation indicates an incredibly robust, deeply entrenched structural stability. It proves that these internal models are not fleeting developmental phases or moods. They are fundamental cognitive architectures that endure.
When they broke down the specific behaviors, the continuity from infancy to childhood was crystal clear. The children who were classified as secure at 1 year of age behaved securely at age 6.
What did that look like in the room?
When the parent walked in after the hour-long separation, these children affectionately and confidently initiated conversation. They might initiate physical contact, share a toy, or just comfortably resume their play with the parent present. The access to the relationship was open and fluid.
Conversely, the insecure children were still operating under the exact same restrictive rules they developed in infancy. The children who were avoidant at 1 year old deployed the exact same strategy at age 6.
They just ignored the parent.
Yes. When the parent returned, they largely ignored them. They offered minimal responses to the parent's greetings, physically kept their distance, and maintained a rigid focus on the toys or the activities in the room. They were still actively deactivating their attachment system to prevent access to emotional information.
But the evolution of the disorganized kids is perhaps the most fascinating part of this, because at age 1, their behavior collapsed. They froze, they were dazed.
Right.
But you can't just freeze every time you interact with your parent for the rest of your life.
No, the brain demands a strategy.
Exactly. A 6-year-old brain is more advanced. It attempts to create a strategy to manage the chaos. And the researchers found that these formerly disorganized infants generally bifurcated into 2 highly controlling patterns upon reunion.
What were the 2 patterns?
Well, some became controlling and directly punitive toward the parent, almost bullying them. But others displayed a pattern the researchers termed inappropriate role reversal. They became overly bright, highly anxious, caregiving figures to their own parents.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. They were essentially trying to manage and soothe the parent's emotional state because their internal model dictated that the parent was incapable of managing theirs.
It is a tragic adaptation. The child sacrifices their own need for comfort to ensure the stability of the unpredictable caregiver.
It really is.
But as insightful as these reunion behaviors are, they are still physical actions. The stated mission of this paper is a move to the level of representation. The researchers needed to know how the child reacts to the concept or the idea of the parent, independent of the parent's actual presence.
Which brings us back to the photograph. Remember the story of Thomas from the beginning of our discussion? The researchers engineered a scenario to recreate that exact phenomenon.
This is where that Polaroid comes back into play.
Yes. During the hour that the parents were out of the room being interviewed, the child is in the playroom with the examiner. And amidst various tasks, the examiner casually hands the 6-year-old the Polaroid picture that was taken of their family when they first arrived.
The examiner simply says, "Here's a photograph of yourself and your family, and you see you are all together."
The brilliance of this test lies in its simplicity and its psychological neutrality. A photograph cannot initiate an interaction. It cannot coerce the child. It doesn't smile, frown, or offer comfort.
No, it's just a mirror, essentially.
Exactly. Any reaction the child exhibits is purely a projection of their own internal working model onto that 2-dimensional image. It is a direct window into the rules governing their mental representations.
And how do the kids react?
Well, the researchers had 2 independent judges who had absolutely zero knowledge of how these children behaved as infants watch the videotapes of the children receiving the photograph. And the results mirrored the infant classifications with uncanny precision.
They lined up perfectly.
Perfectly. The secure children took the photograph, looked at it, smiled, perhaps offered a spontaneous, pleasant comment about it to the examiner, and then casually set it down or handed it back. They had free and open cognitive access to the representation of their family, and that access did not overwhelm their emotional system.
The insecure avoidant children, however, reacted much like Thomas did at the end of his separation.
They turned away.
Yes. When handed the photograph, they physically turned away from it. Some refused to even take it from the examiner's hand. If the examiner placed it near them on the table, they would turn the picture face down or look in the completely opposite direction.
It's like it burned them.
Right. Their internal rules were dictating that this visual reminder of the attachment figure was dangerous information that must be actively blocked from conscious processing.
And the reaction of the disorganized children is genuinely heartbreaking. They didn't just casually avoid the photo, they became visibly depressed or disorganized merely by looking at it.
The paper details one specific incident with a little girl, right?
Yes, this one really got me. She had been happily playing in a sandbox with the examiner, totally cheerful and engaged. And the examiner casually hands her the family photograph. The moment she looks at it, her entire demeanor collapses. She takes on a deeply depressed aspect, stops playing entirely, and bends silently over the photograph, just staring at it for 12 agonizing seconds.
12 seconds of complete shutdown.
It is wild to consider the sheer power of this cognitive mechanism. A simple piece of glossy paper can trigger a cascading series of unconscious rules in a 6-year-old's brain, completely shutting down their ability to experience joy or engage in play.
It perfectly illustrates the concept that the internal working model is an active, ongoing sensor. But physical reactions to a photograph, while profoundly indicative of representational shifts, are still only one piece of the puzzle.
Right, because a reaction is still somewhat behavioral.
Exactly. If the researchers truly wanted to map the architecture of these internal models, they had to analyze the ultimate tool of cognitive representation: language.
They needed to investigate how these children explicitly talk about, conceptualize, and imagine attachment and separation.
Right. And to do that, they administered the separation anxiety test. This was originally developed by Hansberg for adolescents, but adapted for younger children by Kleigsbrun and Bowlby.
So what is the test exactly?
The examiner shows the 6-year-old a series of 6 photographs. These aren't photos of the child's own family. They are just still images of a hypothetical child undergoing various separations from their parents.
So like cartoonish representations.
Yeah, illustrations. And the scenarios range from mild, like the parents saying goodnight and putting the child to bed, to severe, like the parents leaving for a 2-week vacation.
Okay.
For each photograph, the examiner asks the 6-year-old 2 very specific questions. What would this child feel? And what would this child do?
And through these questions, the researchers were measuring a concept they called emotional openness. They wanted to observe whether the child could maintain a functional balance between self-exposure, acknowledging vulnerability and distress, and self-containment, managing those feelings without becoming emotionally dysregulated.
Could they access difficult, painful feelings without their cognitive system falling apart?
The secure kids navigated this hypothetical landscape beautifully. When shown a picture of parents leaving, they could openly and fluidly admit, oh, the kid is sad, or the kid is angry, and they could easily provide logical, coherent reasons why the child would feel that way.
They didn't fall apart.
Not at all. They completed the task with ease, engaging with the examiner without withdrawing or becoming distressed. They demonstrated that their internal rules allowed full access to emotional realities.
The insecure children, on the other hand, exhibited profound restrictions in their cognitive and emotional processing.
How so?
Well, some of the avoidant children couldn't spontaneously express any feelings at all, defaulting to a flat, passive, Others became visibly depressed and uncommunicative. But again, the most striking and disturbing reactions came from the children who were classified as disorganized in infancy.
Their responses to these hypothetical separations often unraveled into highly irrational, bizarre, or aggressive behavior.
The paper highlights one specific girl, who was category D as an infant. When asked how the pictured child would feel about the parents leaving for 2 weeks, she aggressively and irrationally insisted that the child would feel good or feel nothing.
Just complete denial.
Complete denial. And while she was vehemently denying any distress, her behavior completely contradicted her words. She became increasingly hysterical and started violently hitting a stuffed animal she was holding, screaming, "Bad lion, bad lion."
Oh, wow.
Her internal system was so utterly overwhelmed by the mere concept of separation that her language entirely detached from her emotional reality, and the suppressed anxiety leaked out as physical violence.
To understand the mechanics of this, we have to refer back to Bowlby's core theory. Bowlby argued that if a child has constructed a working model of their caregiver as generally accessible and responsive, they can use that internal mental image to comfort themselves and to cope with real-life or imagined separations.
They literally have the mental architecture required to construct solutions.
The insecure children, particularly the disorganized ones, literally lack the cognitive framework to imagine a constructive response to distress. Because their model of the caregiver is either rejecting, unpredictable, or terrifying, their minds cannot simulate a scenario where reaching out results in comfort.
That's the key. They can't simulate a positive outcome.
To really grasp the stark difference in this mental architecture, I want to read some of the actual quotes from the transcripts provided in the paper's appendix. Hearing the exact words these 6-year-olds used brings the data to life.
Yeah, let's hear the transcripts.
Let's look at the severe scenario, the examiner asks. The parents are going away on vacation for 2 weeks. What's this little girl or boy going to do? Let's start with the secure kids. One boy says, "Run away and leave a sign on the car."
Which is funny but logical.
Right. And when the examiner probes and asks where he'll go, the boy casually says, "Probably going to catch a bus. Tell him to take him to San Francisco. He has money." Another secure child simply says the girl will cry and stamp her feet. Another suggests she will go find a grown-up friend of the parents to stay with.
Notice the underlying logic of these responses. They are engaging in active, constructive problem solving. Even the child who suggests crying and stamping her feet is providing a highly functional, adaptive response.
Because it communicates the distress.
Exactly. Stamping feet is a direct, robust expression of distress aimed explicitly at changing the parent's behavior. These secure children are actively engaging with the problem because their internal working model operates on the fundamental assumption that attachment figures respond to communication. They believe they have agency in their relationships.
Now contrast that agency with the transcripts from the avoidant kids. It is a complete wall of shutdown. Child 2 says, "I don't know." Child 3 just shrugs and remains entirely silent. Child 5 says, Nothing. The examiner pushes gently. What will she do for 2 weeks? Child 5 replies, I don't know.
It's complete stonewalling.
Their cognitive censor has completely deleted the emotional inquiry before the conscious mind can even attempt to process it.
Their security operation dictates that the safest, most adaptive response to attachment-related stress is to completely deactivate the attachment system. They cut off all access to the feelings, and consequently, they cut off all access to any imagined solutions.
Because to even think about a solution would require acknowledging the distress, which violates their internal rules.
Right. It breaks the algorithm.
And then we reach the transcripts for the ambivalent and disorganized kids, and their answers are remarkably dark and chaotic.
Let's hear them.
One child says the boy is going to toss a bow and arrow and shoot them, shoot his mom and dad. Another child suggests the boy will hide away, probably get locked up in his closet. Another child just says the boy will feel like kicking the car.
Because their internal models of the caregiver are inherently unpredictable or a source of terror, they cannot computationally imagine a scenario where reaching out or communicating helps.
So they default to violence.
Therefore, their imagined solutions default to violent retaliation, self-destructive acting out, or total paralyzing isolation. It represents a profound restriction of thought and imagination.
Okay, so that clearly demonstrates how they manage their internal models when talking about hypothetical situations with an examiner. But what about real life?
Right, the everyday stuff.
What about when they are actually talking face-to-face with their parents? Does this invisible set of rules affect the flow of a casual conversation?
To test this, the researchers executed a brilliant methodological maneuver. They took the videotapes of that 3-minute unstructured reunion between the 6-year-old and the parent. So one we talked about earlier.
Right.
But they didn't watch the videos. They stripped away all the visual data. They stripped away the tone of voice. They simply generated raw text transcripts of the dialogue. Just the words spoken.
Just the text.
Just the text. These transcripts were then analyzed completely blind by a psycholinguistics student named Amy Strage. She had no idea which dyads were secure or insecure.
This is a masterstroke of research design. By isolating the discourse itself, independent of physical cues or vocal inflection, they sought to prove that the rules of the internal working model are embedded in the very structural mechanics of how we take turns speaking.
Strage wasn't just looking at what they talked about. She evaluated the fluidity of the conversation, the dyadic balance, meaning who was controlling the flow, and the specific focus of the topics.
And once again, the raw text transcripts perfectly predicted the infant attachment categories from 5 years prior. The dyads that were secure in infancy produced fluid, easily balanced dialogue at age 6.
Neither the parent nor the child dominated the conversation.
There were very few awkward, prolonged pauses, and they seamlessly covered a wide range of topics. They talked about feelings, they talked about the toys, they talked about the separation. It read like a genuinely good, easy, connected conversation.
The transcripts of the avoidant dyads, however, revealed highly restricted, rigid communication patterns. Strage noted frequent, heavy, uncomfortable pauses.
And crucially, the topics of conversation were severely restricted. They focused almost exclusively on impersonal perspectives and inanimate objects.
They talked at length about the toys in the room, but deliberately avoided any mention of the fact that they had just been separated for an hour or how they felt about it.
The parents in these dyads often relied on empty, rhetorical questions that didn't require genuine emotional engagement. They were collaboratively maintaining the avoidant rule. Do not access or share emotional information.
And the disorganized dyads were characterized by what Strage termed disfluent discourse.
What does that mean exactly?
The transcripts were full of stumbling, false starts, and fragmented sentences from both the parent and the child. Interestingly, unlike the avoidant dyads, they would attempt to focus on relationships and feelings, but the conversation lacked any coherent structure.
And strikingly, the transcripts revealed that the parents in these disorganized dyads often passively allowed the 6-year-old child to steer and control the conversation.
It was the conversational manifestation of that inappropriate role reversal we discussed earlier. The child was taking the conversational lead because the parent was incapable of providing a secure structure.
Which brings us to perhaps the most profound and far-reaching realization of this entire research paper. This rigid, rule-bound structuring of conversation doesn't magically disappear when a child grows up.
It doesn't.
It doesn't just apply to 6-year-olds navigating a lab setting. The researchers found the exact same phenomenon when they turned their analytical lens onto the adults.
This begs a massive question. If a 6-year-old's language is already fundamentally shaped by their internal working model, what does an adult's internal working model look like after 30 or 40 years of running and reinforcing that exact same code?
This is where we look at what the parents were doing during that hour they spent in separate offices. The researchers were administering the Adult Attachment Interview, or the AAI.
Yes, designed by Carol George, Nancy Kaplan, and Mary Main.
And the absolute genius of the AI is that it fundamentally does not care what the adult claims their childhood was like. It assumes that people are unreliable narrators of their own lives.
So they weren't fact-checking the childhoods.
Right. The researchers weren't just taking the facts of the story at face value. The AAI is essentially a test of conversational coherence. It probes the adult for general descriptions of their early relationships with their parents. It asks them to provide specific autobiographical memories to back up those general descriptions.
It pushes them to discuss instances of rejection, physical hurt, or loss.
And it asks how the adult believes these early experiences shaped their current adult personality. What the researchers were meticulously analyzing was not the historical accuracy of the childhood, but the coherence versus the unconscious contradiction within the narrative.
They were evaluating the adult's overall working model of attachment by how their mind processed and presented the information in real time.
Let's break down the patterns of incoherence they discovered in the insecure adults, because it perfectly mirrors the children. Let's look at the parents of the avoidant children. The paper classifies their adult interview style as dismissive.
Okay, dismissive. These dismissive adults would frequently offer highly idealized general statements, claiming they had a fine, normal, or excellent relationship with their parents. But the contradiction emerged when the interviewer pressed for a specific memory to illustrate that excellence.
For instance, the paper cites a father who insisted his mother was excellent, but later in the interview, he casually recounted a story where he had broken his hand and was too terrified to tell her about it.
To understand why this happens, we have to look at how the brain stores information. In psychology, we differentiate between semantic memory and episodic memory.
Okay, explain the difference there.
Semantic memory is your generalized, categorical knowledge. The rules and labels you apply to the world, like Paris is the capital of France, or in this case, my mother was excellent.
It's the label.
Right. Episodic memory, on the other hand, is the specific, time-traveling recollection of a lived event. The memory is sitting in your room with a broken hand, feeling terrified.
In a coherent mind, semantic and episodic memory align. The label matches the data.
But in a dismissive, avoidant adult, the internal rules demand that they idealize the parent to maintain a semblance of security while simultaneously blocking access to the painful episodic memories that contradict that idealization. The rule, the semantic part, is entirely severed from the reality, the episodic part.
Additionally, these adults often strongly insisted they simply couldn't remember large swaths of their childhoods, a classic hallmark of repressed episodic memory.
The parents of the disorganized children exhibited a different kind of incoherence. The paper notes they often showed signs of uncompleted mourning.
Right. They had experienced the loss of an attachment figure or severe trauma, but their discussion of it during the interview was highly irrational or disorganized. Their narratives would oscillate wildly between positive and negative evaluations.
And their sentences would sometimes become so tangled they would literally lose track of the interview question they were answering.
And the ambivalent parents, termed preoccupied, were still actively entangled in their childhoods. They spoke as if they were still actively trying to please or fight with their own parents, displaying ongoing anger or passivity that showed they were still trapped in the old relationship dynamics, even in adulthood.
But I think the most hopeful and honestly the most surprising finding in this entire paper relates to the secure adults.
Definitely. When I first approached this material, my logical assumption was that the parents of the highly secure, well-adjusted 6-year-olds must have had perfect, idyllic childhoods themselves. I assumed security was just the product of a flawless upbringing.
But the data proves that completely wrong.
Completely wrong. Many of these secure adults had experienced trauma, they had faced rejection, they had endured loss and hardship. The critical difference wasn't the absence of pain. The difference was that their narratives were integrated. They didn't rely on idealization.
They valued attachment, but they possessed the cognitive freedom to discuss it objectively. They had open access to both positive and negative memories, and they could weave them together into a coherent, realistic understanding of their own lives.
They didn't need to suppress the negative data to feel safe.
There is this one specific interaction detailed in the text that I absolutely love. It involves a father of a securely attached son.
Oh, the rejection quote.
Yes. During the AAI, the interviewer asks this father if he ever felt rejected during his childhood. Instead of getting defensive or claiming he couldn't remember, this man just laughs heartily and says, "If that ain't rejection, I don't know what the hell is."
Which is just incredible self-awareness.
And then he effortlessly launches into a highly coherent, thoughtful, detailed history of his own abuse and familial separations. He didn't hide his trauma behind a cognitive barrier. He had processed it. He had integrated it to his reality.
This specific finding fundamentally flips our cultural understanding of parenting on its head. In modern discourse, we often talk about parents being insensitive to their children's emotional needs, and we usually frame this insensitivity as a conscious, selfish choice or a moral failing. We assume the parent just doesn't care enough.
But the profound implication of this paper is that insensitive parenting might actually just be a byproduct of a parent's internal rules restricting their own memory and attention.
If a mother's internal working model dictates that she must forcefully block out her own childhood memories of vulnerability and fear in order to function, she will automatically, unconsciously block out her infant's signals of vulnerability and fear.
She literally lacks the cognitive bandwidth to process the infant's distress because acknowledging it would violate her own internal security operations.
Her insensitivity is not malice. It is simply her own survival mechanism running its course, blinding her to the reality of her child's needs.
So if we follow this logic to its conclusion, what does this all mean for us as human beings?
Right. Are we just concrete molds, poured and set by the time we are 12 months old, doomed to blindly repeat these restricted patterns and unknowingly pass them on to our children for generations? If the behavioral correlation is 0.76 over just 5 years, that feels incredibly deterministic. It feels like we are trapped.
It is crucial to note that the researchers actively push back against that kind of fatalistic template theory. A template implies a passive mold, something you are poured into, and you just harden into that shape permanently.
But they aren't templates.
No. They argue forcefully that these internal models are active security operations. They require energy. Avoidant children and dismissive adults have to actively work millisecond by millisecond to block out attachment signals.
They have to constantly expend mental effort to turn away from the photograph, or to steer the conversation toward inanimate objects, or to repress an episodic memory. It is a continuous, exhausting process of self-preservation.
And the crucial insight that proves this is an active process is that the most secure individuals, the most secure parent-child dyads, are actually the least rule-bound.
When Amy Strage was conducting her blind linguistic analysis of the transcripts, the secure dyads were actually the most difficult to mathematically classify. Why? Because they had no rigid stylistic tics.
They had no predictable regularities or forced limitations in their speech. Their attention just flowed freely and organically wherever the conversation naturally led them.
They didn't have to expend energy policing their own thoughts. To be truly secure is to be free of the restrictive rules.
Before we move to the final conclusions of how we can achieve that freedom, we must address one highly specific, slightly bizarre statistical anomaly in the data. It reveals something very deep about the hierarchy of human memory. We've spent this entire time talking primarily about the mothers, but remember, the researchers tested the fathers too.
Right. The infant strange situation baseline was conducted with the mothers at 12 months, and then a completely separate strange situation was conducted with the fathers at 18 months. The infants had distinct relationships with each parent.
But when the researchers analyzed the 6-year-old's representational world, their response to the family photograph, their answers on the separation anxiety test, they found it was heavily, almost exclusively predicted by their infant security with their mother.
It had almost no statistical relationship to their infant security with their father, and this was true even though the 6-year-old's physical reunion behavior with the father was stable. The physical relationship endured, but the mental representation defaulted to the mother.
This is a vital nuance. It does not mean the relationship with the father is unimportant or that it doesn't exist within the child's cognitive map. Rather, it points to Bowlby's theory of a hierarchy of internal working models.
The human brain, when processing complex or ambiguous emotional data, requires a default organizational setting. When these 6-year-olds were presented with ambiguous stimuli concerning the entire family unit, like a photograph showing everyone together, or a hypothetical story about both parents leaving on vacation, their minds automatically defaulted to the primary model situated at the top of their cognitive hierarchy.
For the vast majority of this specific sample, assessed in the 1980s, that primary overarching model, was constructed around the mother.
It's like a complex organization where you might have different managers for different departments, but when a company-wide crisis hits, everyone defaults to the CEO's policy. The mind seeks the primary organizing principle.
So if these rules are actively maintained and they operate on a strict hierarchy, is there any hope of rewriting the manual?
If a listener realizes they're operating on a dismissive, avoidant, or disorganized script, are they stuck with that architecture forever?
The researchers conclude their paper on a profound note of hope, and they ground that hope in the mechanics of cognitive development. They'd point specifically to the onset of what Jean Piaget termed formal operations, a cognitive stage that typically begins in adolescence.
Okay, let's break down formal operations because that is the key to breaking the cycle.
In childhood, during the concrete operational stage, you are largely bound by your immediate concrete experiences. You live inside the rules of your relationship system, but you do not possess the cognitive capacity to view the system itself from the outside. You just react.
But when a human being enters adolescence and develops formal operations, they achieve metacognition.
They develop the ability to think about thought itself.
They gain the abstract cognitive power to step outside their own internal working models, observe their own relationship systems objectively, and critically analyze the rules that have been unconsciously governing them.
You gain the ability to step back and look at the map you've been using, realize it's drawing borders that don't actually exist, and redraw it.
Because you can finally see the rules, you possess the power to rewrite them. You can achieve what psychologists call earned security. Exactly like that father who could laugh freely about his own history of rejection. He wasn't born secure, he earned it through metacognitive processing.
From a one-year-old baby's physical reach, to a 6-year-old's imagined solutions, to an adult's conversational blind spots, human development is a lifelong, active journey of writing, reviewing, and rewriting the rules of connection.
Exactly. The internal working model is highly self-preserving, and it requires effort to dismantle, but because it relies on active maintenance, it is fundamentally alterable.
We can change the code.
I want you, the listener, to think about the unwritten rules governing your own life and your own conversations. Think about the last time you found yourself in a heated argument or a moment of deep vulnerability. When a topic gets dangerously close to the heart, what does your attention do? Do you suddenly find yourself hyper-focusing on trivial details or the inanimate objects in the room? Do you dismiss the importance of the relationship entirely to protect yourself?
Do you become overly anxious and immediately try to manage and soothe the other person's feelings at the expense of your own?
Or can you look at your own history, the flaws, the painful rejections, the chaotic, messy reality of it, and just laugh the truth of it, integrating it into a coherent story? If our minds are actively working every single second to maintain our security by filtering out painful realities, perhaps the bravest, most revolutionary thing we can do is finally drop the rules, let the information in. Thank you for taking this deep dive with us. Until next time, stay curious.